Picture this: an emperor who ruled the mightiest empire on earth, undone by his own grief. Imagine a love so consuming that when it was lost, the man at the center of the ancient world tried to bend reality itself to bring it back. This isn't just another scandal from Rome's gilded halls. It's a story of obsession, cruelty, and the haunting price of unchecked power. And at the heart of it all is a boy named Sporus, whose life was rewritten by an emperor's madness. Nero wasn't born a monster. In fact, when he first ascended to the throne at just 16, Rome believed it had entered a golden age. The empire had seen its fair share of brutal rulers, men who clawed for power through bloodshed. But Nero's early days felt different. He was young, charismatic, and seemingly full of promise. Taxes were reduced, public games were funded for the people's enjoyment, and his personal touch, a love for music and theater, seemed to endear him to ordinary Romans. It's easy to imagine the streets of Rome during those first years, markets buzzing, amphitheaters alive with laughter, a city breathing easier under a ruler who appeared less harsh than his predecessors. Nero didn't hide behind palace walls. He performed. He sang, he acted on stage, and while the aristocrats sneered, the common folk adored it. For a moment, Rome looked forward, not backward. But absolute power is a slow poison. And for Nero, it didn't take long before the sweetness of popularity gave way to the paranoia of supremacy. Historians describe a man who became increasingly convinced that every senator, every general, every ally was a potential enemy. After all, Rome was an empire of 60 million souls, and only one of them could never be contradicted: the emperor himself. What does that do to a person? Americans might compare it to a celebrity who rises overnight, showered with praise, adored by millions, but with no one brave enough to tell them no. Now magnify that by 1,000 ad armies, wealth beyond imagination, and the belief that the gods favored you personally. That was Nero's world. And into that dangerous landscape of isolation and unchecked power entered the one figure who would shape Nero's fate more than any senator or general. She was beautiful, shrewd, and ambitious. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Nero, still in the early glow of his reign, believed he had found in her not just a lover, but a partner who embodied his grandest visions of himself. But history would prove that Poppaea was no ordinary consort. She was the spark that would ignite both his greatest passion and his darkest dissent. When Nero first saw Poppaea Sabina, he was already married, but not happily. His wife Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor Claudius, was dutiful, quiet, and politically convenient. To the Roman people she symbolized stability, but to Nero she was lifeless, uninspiring. Then came Poppaea, dazzling, magnetic, a woman who seemed to command a room simply by entering it. Unlike Octavia, Poppaea relished attention. Ancient sources describe her as vivacious and strikingly intelligent, a woman who knew precisely how to use her beauty as both ornament and weapon. She wasn't content to simply exist in the emperor's orbit. She wanted to shine at its center. For Nero, it was intoxicating. What began as an affair quickly consumed him. The emperor's infatuation turned into obsession, and soon Octavia was cast aside. Rome was shocked. Divorce was not unheard of, but for an emperor to discard a beloved daughter of the imperial line for a mistress was reckless. Yet Nero didn't care. He had found his muse, his obsession, his perfect mirror, and he treated Poppaea not like a wife, but like an idol. He lavished her with treasures from across the empire, silks that had traveled the Silk Road from China, perfumes carried by caravan, from the deserts of Arabia, jewels plucked from the mines of India. The Roman treasury bled for her adornments. In Nero's eyes, no price was too high. But gifts weren't enough. He wanted her completely. He stationed guards at her side not for her safety, but to monitor every glance, every word, every man who dared to linger too long in her presence. He isolated her from friends and family, surrounding her only with those whose loyalty was to him. The emperor was not satisfied with devotion, he demanded possession. Poppaea, for her part, understood the game she was playing. She was no naive beauty swept away by power. She maneuvered within it. She used her influence to build alliances, advancing her family's fortunes, weaving a network of patrons and supporters. For a woman in Rome, a world where politics was dominated by men, this was an extraordinary feat. But she had one fatal flaw: she was unafraid to speak her mind. Most of the imperial court had learned to tiptoe around Nero's moods, feeding his ego, never contradicting him. Poppaea did the opposite. She teased him, mocked his performances when they were poor argued policy, when she disagreed. It was part of what made her irresistible, but also part of what made her dangerous. Imagine a woman in the White House today, not just as First Lady, but as a sharp political mind willing to challenge the president in front of his closest advisors. Americans would admire her strength, but in the world of Rome, where the emperor's will was law, such defiance was perilous. Theirs was not a love story of equals. It was a collision course, obsession meeting, ambition, desire, meeting defiance. And like two stars drawn into each other's gravity, the result would not be balance, but destruction. By the year 65 AD, Nero and Poppaea's marriage had become one of the most scandalous and closely watched dramas in Rome. To outsiders, she lived in splendor, draped in jewels and silks, the empress of the world's greatest empire. But inside the palace, cracks were widening. Poppaea was not like Octavia, who endured Nero's moods in silence. She had her own will, and she wasn't afraid to clash with her husband. She criticized his decisions, mocked his endless performances on stage, and above all, she challenged his priorities. To a man who thought of himself as a god in human form, such defiance stung deeper than any insult. Ancient historians differ on the exact cause of their final quarrel. Tacitus claims it began when Poppaea accused Nero of neglecting his duties as husband and father in favor of chariot races and theatrical shows. Others say it was a private matter, jealousy, suspicion, one of the countless small sparks that ignite domestic storms. What is certain is that Poppaea was pregnant, carrying Nero's child. Perhaps the stress of pregnancy left her less willing to tolerate his volatility. Perhaps she simply refused for once to hold her tongue. The argument escalated, voices rising in the marble halls of the palace. Servants must have frozen, listening from the shadows, knowing that one wrong sound could cost them their lives. And then, in a flash of rage, the emperor of Rome, the man who commanded armies, who ruled 60 million souls, lost control. He struck his wife. Some say it was a violent kick to the stomach. Others suggest a brutal beating. But all accounts agree the blow was fatal. Poppaea collapsed, her unborn child lost with her. Within hours, she was dead. The empress, the woman who had once captivated the most powerful man alive, lay lifeless on the cold floor of her palace. For Nero, the realization must have been instant and devastating. Imagine it, the man who believed he could do anything, bend laws, command legions, silence senators, had destroyed the one person he loved most with his own hands. Historians describe him collapsing in grief, throwing himself over her body, begging her forgiveness, ordering her to live again, as if his authority extended even to death itself. Doctors were summoned in panic. The best Rome had to offer rushed to her side, threatened with torture if they failed, promised fortunes if they succeeded. But there was nothing to be done. The empress was gone. Her death sent ripples through Rome. To the public, it was whispered as one more sign of imperial madness. But inside the palace, it marked a turning point. Nero's obsession with Poppaea did not die with her. It only grew twisted now by guilt and despair into something far darker. The man who had once been seen as a promising young ruler was slipping beyond the reach of reason. Rome expected its emperors to grieve with dignity, to mourn, then move forward. But Nero's sorrow after Poppaea's death was not ordinary grief. It was the unraveling of a man's mind. Instead of allowing her to be cremated in the Roman tradition, Nero ordered her body embalmed and entombed in lavish splendor. The funeral exceeded even those of past emperors. He declared her divine, establishing rituals and shrines in her honor. Poppaea Sabina was now a goddess, not because the Senate decreed it, but because her husband willed it so. Inside the palace, the world bent around Nero's delusion. He refused to acknowledge her absence. Her name was spoken in the present tense, her favorite seat left empty at banquets as though she might appear at any moment. Courtiers, terrified of offending him, played along. They smiled at her vacant chair, toasted her, as though she still lived, and pretended that the emperor's madness was a form of devotion. In Rome, where to cross the emperor could mean exile or execution, it was safer to feign belief than to whisper truth. But grief does not fade. When it is denied, it festers. And in Nero's festering sorrow, reality itself began to warp. He spent hours in her tomb, speaking to her embalmed body, begging her to answer him. Some accounts suggest he dressed statues of her in new gowns, arranged banquets in her honor, even held conversations with her, as though she were simply resting. This wasn't love anymore. It was obsession decayed into necromancy, an emperor trying to command the dead as he had commanded the living. And then one day, Nero's grief found a new outlet. Among the many young men who served in the imperial household was a freed boy named Sporus. Barely in his mid-teens, he was slender, delicate-featured, and bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea, especially in the softness of his eyes and the fine lines of his face. In another life, this resemblance might have been a curious coincidence, a passing remark at court. But in the palace of a grieving emperor who believed he could rewrite reality, it was something far more sinister. Nero looked upon the boy and saw not Sporus, but the ghost of his dead wife. In that instant, the fate of a child was sealed. Sporus would not remain himself for long. He would be remade, molded, broken, forced into the shape of a woman who no longer lived. The tragedy of Poppaea's death had shattered Nero. Now it would shatter Sporus as well. Sporus was probably no older than 14 or 15 when Nero noticed him. Born into slavery in the imperial household, he had been freed as a child, a status that gave him certain privileges, though always tethered to the emperor's will. Freedmen in Rome could hold important positions, manage estates, and even rise to influence, but their lives were balanced on a knife's edge. All their fortune, all their safety depended entirely on imperial favor. One misstep could mean ruin. Yet what set Sporus apart wasn't his education or his service in the palace. It was his face. Ancient writers note that his features bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea's, the shape of the eyes, the softness of the jaw, the delicate frame. To Nero, consumed by grief and delusion, this wasn't coincidence. It was destiny. In Roman culture, resemblance carried meaning. Families often took pride in children who looked like their ancestors, believing physical likeness revealed spiritual kinship. So when Nero gazed at Sporus, he didn't just see a boy, he saw a chance to undo the irreversible. A ghost made flesh, a way to bring Poppaea back. There was only one problem: Sporus was male. But for a man who fancied himself a god, who had convinced himself he could bend life and death to his will, gender was a mere obstacle. Nero would not let biology stand in the way of his fantasy. What happened next was as cruel as it was calculated. The emperor summoned his physicians and ordered a transformation. Sporus was to be remade, not dressed in disguise, not merely groomed to mimic the empress, but permanently altered. The boy's body would be mutilated, so that he could become, in Nero's mind, Poppaea reborn. Imagine the terror of being a teenager summoned to the private chambers of the most powerful man in the world and being told your very self was about to be erased. Sporus had no voice in the matter, no protection, no path of escape. He was property again, not legally, but in every practical sense. In that moment, the boy named Sporus began to vanish, and in his place the emperor's twisted vision of Poppaea Sabina was about to emerge. The transformation of Sporus was not symbolic. It was physical, violent, and final. Nero commanded his physicians to perform castration, a brutal procedure in the ancient world with primitive instruments and only the crudest forms of anesthesia. Even for those who survived, infection was common, the pain unimaginable, and the consequences lifelong. For Sporus, there was no choice. Held down by guards, his screams echoing against the palace walls, he endured a mutilation that stripped away not only his ability to father children, but in the eyes of Roman society, his very place as a man. When it was done, he was no longer seen as male, nor fully female. He was something in between, forced into a category that didn't exist in Roman norms except as spectacle. But Nero's cruelty didn't end with surgery. Once Sporus healed, his training began. Imperial seamstresses fitted him with gowns designed to mimic Poppaea's style, cut to flatter his altered body. Jewelers adorned him with pieces that had once belonged to the dead empress, binding him to her memory in chains of gold. Makeup artists taught him how to rouge his cheeks, darken his eyes, soften the sharpness of his face. Hairdressers spent hours arranging his curls in elaborate fashions copied from portraits of Poppaea. Each lesson chipped away at his identity. He was drilled in how to walk with feminine grace, how to sit with ladylike posture, how to gesture with delicate restraint. Voice coaches tried to raise the pitch of his speech, teaching him patterns of conversation that would sound more appropriate for a woman of high station. Every movement, every glance, every word was reprogrammed to erase Sporus the boy and replace him with a phantom bride. And he was given a new name, Sabina, the name of Nero's lost empress. To call him Sporus now was dangerous, even forbidden. In Nero's presence, he was never the boy again. He was Poppaea reborn. The psychological torture was relentless. Each morning, Sporus awoke in chambers decorated with Poppaea's portraits, surrounded by her perfumes, clothed in her silks. Each evening he went to bed, knowing that tomorrow he would again have to act out the role of someone he had never met, a ghost he was forced to embody. Every mirror reflected back not his own face, but the emperor's fiction. Imagine being a teenager and told that your very self, your memories, your hopes, your identity no longer mattered. That you were only valuable because you resembled someone else. That every day you must live a performance flawless and endless, because to falter meant death. In Rome's glittering palaces filled with gold and marble, this was the real theater, the spectacle of a boy erased, remade into a doll for an emperor who could not let go of the woman he had destroyed. By the spring of 67 AD, Nero's delusion reached its most grotesque display. The emperor announced what no one could have imagined: he would marry Sporus. Not in secret, not in whispers, but in a full imperial wedding ceremony sanctioned and celebrated as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The preparations were staggering. Rome had seen countless spectacles, triumphal parades, gladiatorial games, festivals with thousands of animals slaughtered in the arena, but nothing compared to this. Nero poured the empire's wealth into making the occasion unforgettable. The palace halls were draped in flowers imported from Egypt, lamps burned by the thousands musicians rehearsed the traditional wedding hymns, and at the center of it all stood Sporus, dressed in bridal white jewels glittering in his hair, his body and soul buried under the identity of Poppaea Sabina. The ceremony followed every Roman custom. Vows were spoken, hands joined, bread shared. Legal documents were signed, ensuring that this mockery of a union carried the full weight of imperial law. To the public, it was declared as the emperor's marriage as real as any that had come before. To those inside the palace, it was a theater of horror. Senators, generals, courtiers, all forced to smile, to offer congratulations, to pretend they were witnessing not madness, but majesty. And yet beneath the surface, the air must have been electric with dread. Imagine being in that audience, applauding as your ruler exchanged vows with a teenage boy, surgically altered to resemble his dead wife. You couldn't laugh. You couldn't recoil. Your life depended on playing your part. The court became actors in a play written by a man who could kill with a word. From that day forward, Sporus was treated as Rome's empress. He was given his own household staff, his own litter for processions, even a treasury allowance. At public banquets, he sat beside Nero, not as a servant, not as a consort, but as a wife. To question it was treason. To acknowledge the truth was death. But luxury is not freedom. Every necklace he wore, every gown he put on, every glance he cast in public was part of the performance. Nero did not want Sporus. He wanted Poppaea, and Sporus was the puppet forced to bring her back. The boy's entire existence became a role, a high-stakes act where forgetting a line or faltering in his movements could cost him his life. And perhaps the cruelest detail of all, Nero seemed to believe it. He spoke to Sporus as though he were Poppaea herself. He reminisced about memories they had never shared, expected answers from a life that Sporus had never lived. For the emperor, the fiction was reality. For Sporus, reality had become a prison where even his name no longer belonged to him. The wedding was meant to be a triumph proof that Nero's will could overcome death itself. But in truth, it revealed the emperor's madness to everyone who witnessed it. Rome had seen decadent rulers before, but never had it seen an emperor try to resurrect the dead by remaking the living. If Nero's wedding to Sporus shocked Rome, what followed displayed the madness to the wider world. In 67 AD, Nero embarked on a grand tour of Greece, a land he idolized as the birthplace of theater music and philosophy. He fancied himself not just an emperor, but an artist, a singer, a lyre player, a charioteer who deserved to stand alongside Greece's greatest performers. Naturally, Sporus went with him, not as a companion or servant, but as his empress. Draped in silks adorned in jewels, carried in a gilded litter, the boy walked beside the Emperor of Rome as though he were Poppaea herself. Everywhere they went, the fiction had to be maintained. Courtiers bowed, dignitaries addressed him as lady, and foreign kings offered gifts, as though honoring the empress of the empire. Imagine being a Greek noble in the audience forced to watch this strange pageant unfold. You knew this was no woman, no empress returned from the grave. Yet Rome's power was absolute, and to question Nero's reality was unthinkable. So you applauded when he sang off-key on stage, cheered when he drove his chariot, and pretended not to see the farce parading beside him. For Sporus, the Greek tour was the most public stage of his performance. At home in Rome, the masquerade had been confined to palace walls and Roman ceremonies. In Greece, he was displayed before entire cities. Every movement was a test, every word an examination. The weight of Nero's madness rested squarely on his shoulders. Meanwhile, back in the empire, Nero's indulgences were tearing Rome apart. While he basked in applause, abroad rebellions began to simmer. Governors who had grown weary of his theatrics and neglect of state affairs started raising armies. The Praetorian Guard, once the bedrock of imperial security, began to doubt whether Nero was fit to rule. But in Greece, Nero carried on as if untouched by these storms. He declared victories in competitions where judges had no choice but to award him first place. He basked in ovations choreographed for fear rather than love. And at his side always was Sporus, the boy who was no longer allowed to be himself, trapped in the skin of a dead empress, forced to endure the stares of thousands who played along with the emperor's fantasy. The Greek tour was meant to be a triumph of art and power. Instead, it revealed a truth that everyone could see, but no one could say Rome was being ruled by a man consumed not by empire, but by delusion. And as Nero reveled in his make-believe glory, the empire he ruled was quietly preparing to rise against him. By 68 AD, the empire could take no more. Nero's extravagance had drained the treasury, his neglect had left provinces restless, and his bizarre theatrics had humiliated Rome in the eyes of its own elite. Rebellions erupted. Governors declared open opposition, and then came the final betrayal. The Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, abandoned him. The Senate, sensing the winds of change, declared Nero a public enemy. The emperor, who once commanded 30 legions, fled Rome in disguise, a shadow of his former glory. And with him went Sporus. Even in his final days, Nero could not part with the living shadow of Poppaea. They hid together in a villa outside the city, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle. But as enemy riders closed in, Nero made his last desperate choice. Cornered, abandoned, and terrified of humiliation, he ended his own life. His final words, according to legend, were a lament, "What an artist dies in me." For Sporus, Nero's death was not freedom. It was a new kind of captivity. He had been molded into a symbol of imperial decadence, and now that symbol was too valuable and too dangerous to ignore. In the bloody year that followed, as rival claimants fought for the throne, in what history calls the year of the 4 emperors, Sporus became a prize passed from man to man. First to Nymphidius Sabinus, then to Otho, then to Vitellius. Each treated him not as himself, but as an extension of Nero's twisted creation, keeping him dressed as a woman, calling him by Poppaea's name. But it was under Vitellius that the nightmare reached its final cruelty. The new emperor, desperate to entertain Rome with fresh spectacles, devised a performance for the Colosseum. He wanted Sporus to take part in a reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, a tale of a maiden dragged into the underworld against her will. The implication was clear: it would be a spectacle of sexual violence humiliation staged before thousands. For Sporus, this was the breaking point. After years of being remade, paraded, and possessed, he refused to become a public joke. Stripped of identity, stripped of choice, he made the only decision left that was truly his own. He took his life, some say, with poison, others with a blade, before he could be forced into the arena. He was perhaps 20 years old. In that act, Sporus reclaimed the smallest fragment of the humanity that had been stolen from him. His suicide was both tragedy and defiance, a refusal to let the empire strip away the last shreds of dignity he had left. Today, his story is often told as a symbol of Rome's decadence, a cautionary tale of how absolute power corrodes not only rulers, but those caught in their orbit. But beneath the layers of history, what makes Sporus unforgettable is not just the cruelty he endured, it's that in the end he chose for himself. He was a boy forced to become an empress, a human being erased and rewritten by another man's obsession. And yet even in death, Sporus reminds us that there are limits to power, that no emperor, however mighty, can ultimately claim ownership over the human soul. And that is the haunting story of Sporus, a tale of obsession, cruelty, and resilience, buried within the grandeur of ancient Rome. Stories like this remind us that behind every marble column and imperial triumph were real people often silenced by history, whose lives carry lessons even today. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see Sporus as a victim of history? Or as someone who, in his final choice, showed remarkable courage? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you'd like to uncover more forgotten stories from the past, the kind that reveal the humanity behind the history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Together, we'll keep exploring the hidden corners of time.